hi, Jenna.
Well, hi, Shelby.
How we doing today?
Oh, we're doing great.
This is going to be so fun.
Yeah, we got a really good one coming today, I think.
I think so, too. We've been making notes for this for literally months.
Yeah, it's been a while that we've been trying to keep track and collect a good range, because I think it was in 2022 maybe that I had started making a little bit of a personal goal just to branch out on what I've read more. I've been reading a lot of fantasy romance and I love it, but sometimes it's fun to try different genres and stuff too. And so today we're going to be trying to give some of our suggestions for what we think good books would be to get into a genre if you've never read it before. Give you kind of an opportunity to branch out.
Yeah. So this is our intro to genres.
Yeah.
So we are going to try to keep it mostly spoiler free.
Yeah.
So this could be a lot of us reading off the back of the book. But yeah, these are all going to be, if you haven't read a specific genre, if you haven't read a specific genre or you're looking to get more into one, these are going to be the perfect places to start. So with that, should we start with some fantasy romance?
Let's start with
fantasy.
Maybe we'll start with fantasy as a bucket.
Let's start.
And maybe
with
fantasy romance there.
All right. Well, I guess I'll start with the number one book to start with if you want to get into fantasy romance. This is what got me into fantasy romance. This is, of course, A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas.
Yep.
I absolutely loved this book. This is still having its moment on TikTok and Instagram, and I feel like people are constantly picking up and telling me that they're reading this.
Yeah, I definitely see a lot of people getting into it, and it is really approachable fantasy too. I think even though there is a lot of magic and other things, it's like so easy to comprehend. I think like you can choose to dive really deep into it, like I know we have, but you don't have to.
Right.
You can take it at face value and really enjoy it like that too.
And I've definitely seen people do both. So it's been really fun to see. And I feel like this would be great for people too who want more of like a romance subplot to it, because I feel like sometimes when you get into fantasy and magic and you haven't necessarily had that before, having that romance subplot is like something you can lean on a little bit.
I agree. And so then kind of on a similar front, Fourth Wing, this other one that has really been very popular lately, and for good reason. I think even if you haven't read a lot of fantasy before, dragons are fun, war college is cool, male love interests are hot. It's a really like fun and fast story. And so I think that's another one where if you're trying to dabble your feet into fantasy and you've been more of a fiction or of a nonfiction reader before, that's a good place to start.
I agree too. That was one of the first books that we covered on the podcast, and both of us felt like it was so easy to read. It was enjoyable. It had the magic, but also the romance.
Yep.
Yeah, I loved it. And I loved the second one even more.
Yeah, I loved both of them. I'm excited for the third one to come out in January.
Me too. So pumped for that. My next one that I have in the fantasy bucket is actually going to be where our name comes from. And so this one is From Blood and Ash. And this, I felt like, was also a great mix of fantasy and romance. And I feel like the characters were just so lovable, and I found myself giggling and kicking my feet. It was so much fun, and I feel like without giving too much away, this is a great one to read if you read Twilight growing up.
Yeah, I guess kind of. I could see that path actually. I also, when I first read From Blood and Ash, and it was, I think the only other fantasy romance I had read was ACOTAR at the time, and this was like the second one that I picked up. The twist was a twist to me. I was like very surprised the first time I read it. And in the first book, if you've read it, there's like a big twist that happens in there. And I loved the twist and loved the way that took the story.
Yes.
So I highly recommend that one too.
It's
a little slow to get through the beginning of it. So you just kind of have a little bit of patience to get maybe past the halfway point.
Yeah. And I remember I was reading it in Steamboat, and you're like, where are you at? Where are you at? Where are you at? And I'm like, I'm here. And I felt like I was reading it pretty fast. And oh gosh, I was loving it. You were like, that twist. And I'm like, I did not see that coming. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yes, for sure.
And the second one in that series too, I think I loved even more than the first one. So yeah, that entire series has just been so good. And that's where our name comes from too. There's a special journal, and so when you get there you have to let us know.
So on a slightly different side, but still in the like more approachable fantasy, maybe heavier romance subplot, but a mix of the two is the Shepherd King duology.
Oh, yeah.
So this starts with One Dark Window, and this one, I think part of why I put it in that like approachable category is because the magic is really, I don't want to say straightforward, but it's like easy to understand the way that it's written. And I think the world gets set up really quickly and you can dive into it pretty quickly. So if you aren't used to building your mental image of like different worlds and different politics and different religions and stuff, I think that this is like a nice stripped down version of you don't have to get too involved in all the rest of it. You like really only see the magic and a little bit of the myth kind of portion of it in it. And there's 2 romance like subplots that you get into in the duology, which I think are good too, and they're both a little bit different, which is kind of fun. So I think, and it's only 2 books, which is nice. So it's not a big long series to commit to. So I really think that this is another good one for people who haven't read fantasy romance before or haven't read fantasy and are like trying to, I don't know, try different areas of that.
And the one thing that I really liked about that too with the magic system is it was really well explained.
Yes.
And so they describe why you have the magic, what the magic is. And it's like they create like this list for you. And so if I ever did get like if I questioned what was happening, I could just flip back to that page and be like, oh, this is what was happening. And so it was really fun to have that magic system, but like also be able to reference like the past and everything.
Plus it's really poetic writing. I really enjoyed the writing style of it. It was like very lyrical. I don't know how to describe it, but it did feel kind of like a poem.
Yeah, it absolutely, the whole book did.
It was very good to read.
We did that for our book club. Was that October?
I think it's October.
And everybody loved it in the book club. So highly recommend.
Yeah.
Another one that we just did for our book club that I've got on my list for fantasy is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. And this would be a really great intro because it has all of the classic tropes for fantasy romance. And so if you read this first, you're going to kind of get that really great intro to like, here's what fantasy romance looks like. And yeah, I loved this one. I thought it was tropey, but it was still really enjoyable, pretty fast paced. The magic wasn't overly heavy.
Yeah, I was going to say it gives you a good taste of what fantasy romance can seem like because the romance is a way larger part of the plot than like the world or magic or anything like that. It's like much more about relationships than it is about magic. And I think like similarly, even for the first ACOTAR book, I think that's kind of the same idea. It's like more about romance than it is about the world in the beginning. And so I think that that's a good starting place for people.
Agreed. And I feel like it would be especially good as an intro to fantasy romance because if you have been reading all of these other books, the book was still good. It just, you might not get as much excitement. Unless like if you otherwise would have read it first.
Yeah. Well, so should we move into maybe like a step up from those? Like maybe you've read some fantasy romance before and now you're interested in diving into something that's a little bit more fantasy and a little bit less romance.
I love it. Let's do it.
So my first suggestion for this one is the Darker Shades of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab. So a lot of people know The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, I think. But I loved this trilogy. It's about like basically we're in a world where there's multiple Londons. There's like a couple different Londons and there's very few people who can traverse between the different Londons. And so we're following kind of like one character who's bouncing between the different Londons. All the Londons have, I'd say, a different range of magic available to them to use. And I kind of don't want to get more into it than that because I went in pretty blind and I really enjoyed it that way because then everything felt like a surprise. But I loved the story. I loved the magic. There's a small romance subplot, which I think was really well done. I really liked the characters' arcs in it. It was just a great trilogy. And if you've been reading things that are more romance heavy and you want to try something where maybe romance isn't at the forefront as much, I think that this storyline was easy enough to follow along too, that it was like kind of a good bridge into high fantasy.
Yeah, I feel like the further you get into like more high fantasy, the less romance ends up being.
Yeah, a lot of times I think that's true. Yeah.
What's your next one on that note?
Yeah, the next one I've got kind of on the same vibe of, I'll call it like that medium fantasy point. So maybe like a step up if you've already read fantasy romance, is the original Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. So the first 3 books of it. I think people get nervous or people who haven't read it before maybe get nervous because some of his books are, pretty fat, and there is a lot of world building in it. And that's part of why I think this is really nice in that middle category, because there is a lot of world building. Like, you are learning entirely different political systems, different laws of physics, right? There's magic and things and how that works. But the magic is really clearly explained in a way that you can understand what's going on.
Okay, yeah.
And I just absolutely adore the main character in here. Ven is like one of my all-time favorite female main characters. I love her. And it's got it's such a shock at the end of the first book too, that I went like immediately into the second book from there. And so this will just always have a special place in my heart. This is probably definitely in my top 5 favorite series is this one. It's so good. And it's a really good spot, I think, for taking that step up towards high fantasy.
Yes, which I can absolutely attest this, because I did read Mistborn last year and I loved it. And we've been so busy with other books and whatnot that I still have not read the second one. But it's definitely a book where you're not looking for that romancy subplot.
Right.
You're looking for the world building. You're looking for the magic. You're looking for something that's going to be, it's going to make you think. And it's going to...
Yeah. Well, and it's nice too, if you're somebody who likes... like a heist story. Mistborn also kind of is that. It's like a band of misfits a little bit, sort of criminals, right? There's, I don't know, a lot of different plotting that happens in it, and it's good. It's really great. And then the last one that I have also on that kind of medium fantasy front is The City of Brass, which is the first in the Daevabad trilogy. Just a beautiful story. It's like set in... I don't know, Cairo and then other areas, I guess, close by there. And it kind of goes into like Jinn and stuff like that, and there's a poor girl from Cairo who kind of gets like swept up into this world that she didn't even realize existed. And this one I think is really, and so again, there's some minor romance subplots in here, but I think this one is really good at giving you an introduction to like more of the political and like faith sides of fantasy that are obviously not the same as today. And so it's really interesting because all of the characters, like none of them are perfect. And so all of them, you kind of can see where they're coming from and why they're fighting for what they're fighting for. But nobody's really going about it in all the right way, which I think was just really cool to read about. Yeah,
that's so cool. I actually, you've been recommending this series for me forever, and I know I'm so excited to read it. It's just been sitting on my shelf, and I know I just need to start it.
Yeah, it took me a little bit to get into the beginning of it because I just wasn't familiar with some of the terminology. There's like a lot of like even names for clothing items and stuff that I think are maybe like regionally specific that are shared. And so I was Googling a little bit the first like 100 pages to understand. But then once you have yourself set up in it, it's just, oh man, it was so good. And I loved the ending. Honestly, I was really a big fan of how the series finished out, which is sometimes hard to do.
Yeah.
So it's a great one. City Brass.
So if you haven't realized quite yet, I am not as far along in my fantasy journey as Miss Jenna is. And so if you're looking for these recommendations, Jenna's the perfect person to go to for it.
Maybe for more of the high fantasy, yeah.
I love it. Speaking of some higher fantasy.
Yeah, I've got just a couple more. And so let's say you've read fantasy romance, you've read some of these that are sort of in the middle fantasy realm where they're more about the plot than about the romance, and you want to take it up a step even further to get really into like true adult high fantasy. There's 2 main recommendations that I think would be great starting places. I think you probably hear everyone recommend this one, but this is The Way of Kings, which is the first book in the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. And you probably hear people talk about it a lot, but there's a reason why everyone talks about it a lot. I just read the second one in this series, which is The Words of Radiance. And I think I told you too that that's truly my top book of all time that I have ever read, period. Wild. And I mean, I've read 500, 600 books. I don't even know how many books I've read, but
oh my goodness.
I mean, it was like far and above the best book that I have ever read. It's so well executed. It's really complex. Like there's a lot going on. There's a lot of different areas of the world, a lot of different characters and stuff. So kind of thing, like if you've ever watched Game of Thrones or read Game of Thrones, it's like the same idea where there's a ton of things going on. There's like different types of religions in different areas, different creatures, different everything. And so that's why I put this higher as the higher fantasy, where it's maybe not a good place, in my opinion, to start, because it would be overwhelming if you're not used to building that out in your mind. But if you're like ready to step into it, I mean, it's excellent.
I love it. I love it. And when, oh no,
breaking books.
I know. And as soon as I'm like at a better place, I want to finish the Mistborn trilogy, but like I'm kind of taking my steps. So like I've done some fantasy romance. I've done a little bit of like the medium tier fantasy. Yeah. I'm like, eventually I will get in. I will do that high fantasy.
Well, only if you're interested, right? Like not everybody has the same interest in the books that like get them. But yeah, I've definitely had a lot of fun with some of these higher fantasy ones.
And when you say that it's the best book that you've ever read, how could I not want to read
I know, that's true. So this is my last one in the fantasy category, but this is also on the kind of high fantasy side of it. And that's the Princess Poison Vow. This one, I think I had probably had it in my wrap up last year when we talked about it too. It's more of a like steampunk high fantasy. Just really good. It's multiple romance subplots, and I think the romance is actually stronger in this than it is in those ones. But I put it in this category because, again, it's like a super different world than the world that we live in. And so you really are building out a lot of different understandings of politics and religion and, I don't know, just culture
basically
in general.
Building a whole new world.
Building a whole new world. So I thought it was great. I really loved it.
And when you say steampunk, what do you mean by that?
How do I describe it? Okay, so from the dictionary, steampunk, it says it's sort of a genre of science fiction that has more of a historical setting and typically features like steam-powered machinery rather than advanced technology. So it's a little bit more, I think, like, I don't know, steam engine type stuff, but like a little bit sci-fi-y. So it's not like futuristic sci-fi-y. And
like
I think
past sci-fi-y?
Kind of. Okay. And so I think that the Princess Poison Vow maybe bridges fantasy and sci-fi a little bit. It sits maybe sort of in the middle there a bit. But yeah, it's more like machinery feel. As always, it kind of gives me that vibe a bit.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually a really good description of it. Good. I'm like, I have this whole mental picture in my head now. It kind of reminds me of like an industrial revolution a little bit.
Exactly. So like kind of take that vibe, but then imagine it's like a sci-fi version of that.
Good to know.
Yeah.
That's so fun.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, great choices. I feel like that even gives me like a place to start when I want like, I want something more fantasy. And I'm like, well, I have a whole list here now.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So now we're going to jump into a little bit of like dystopian. And so like your world, but just like a little bit different. And the first series that I have for that one is the Shatter Me series. And we covered the entire series on the podcast last summer. And this one was a really good intro because you don't have to think very hard about it. It was like easy, a very easy read.
It's YA, in case we didn't say that. So,
good.
So the language is really easy because it is YA in there. There's 6 books. They're all pretty short books.
Yeah, so it was so easy. So quick to read. There's a huge romance subplot in there. And so that was a really big forefront of the entire series. And I feel like that, again, makes it just like easier to read. But yeah, you don't have to think too hard about like why it's dystopian or why there are powers. It's kind of like it just is. And it's really well explained. So
yeah, well, and I think that one is kind of interesting too because they give like just enough of how the world came to be that way or like how the world is set up now.
Yeah.
And it was funny when we were covering them, we were like trying to overlay those locations with like the real world locations of where they are. But so I think that part's really done well of setting up the dystopian world setting.
Definitely. Great intro because it's not too far off from where we are in our world now. Yeah.
Good one.
And then the second one that I have on here that is an absolute classic is The Hunger Games.
Oh, yeah. Such a good one. I mean,
a good one.
And especially with the Ballad of Songs and, was it Songs?
Yeah,
Songbird
Snakes and
Songbirds. Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
You know where we're going with that.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, with that movie just coming out, I think people have had a little bit of a resurgence of interest in The Hunger Games. And even as an adult, because that is also a YA dystopian book, even as an adult, I think they're really good. I remember my mom read them the same time that I did when I was younger, and my mom loved them too. And so it's kind of just a testament to say that they're good, even if you're not in the traditional YA bucket of readers.
Oh, that's really exciting. And I feel like if you're getting into like a different genre of books, I feel like having the movie to fall back on too could be a really good way to maybe get your head around it. For me, it's kind of like fan art. So like if I'm like, I cannot picture a person in my head, I would go on and search for fan art and I'm like, oh, that makes more sense.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. I hadn't thought about it like that before, but that is kind of true.
All right. Do you have anything for dystopian?
I do not have any for dystopian, no.
Okay. Should we jump into some sci-fi?
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sci-fi is, I mean, if you've been listening to us at all, you probably know that sci-fi is
that's your jam.
This is my jam. Yeah. I mean, before I got back into reading, so I liked fantasy when I was younger, but before I came back into fantasy as an adult, I actually had read a lot of sci-fi and only sci-fi as an adult.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And so it's fun to try and convince more people to come over from fantasy at least a little bit onto the sci-fi side.
I love it.
So I know that I probably am going to have more recs for you than this genre, but I've got a couple different kind of like subcategories for you to wrap your mind around depending on the style of story that you like the most. So within sci-fi, if you gravitate towards romance, like if you're more interested in having something that's a romance heavy subplot, I have a couple really great suggestions. So the first one is Calamity. The second book, Fiasco, is coming out in June. And I've read that also. They're both excellent.
Because you got an arc, right?
Yeah, they both were 5 stars for me. Yeah, if you ever watched the show Firefly, which was, I think, maybe like an early 2000s show or maybe 2010s, I don't remember. It's an older show about, like kind of like cobbled together ship and a crew coming from all different areas. And so it's a like deep space kind of like setting, but it's not super space heavy in like the sci-fi element. So it's just that the setting is there. But it's very romance forward, good spice, like some spice in there too, if you're looking for some of that. But I also really like the plot line that's going along with it and kind of like what the conspiracies that they're trying to solve, I think are really good going along with the romance. So you get like a fun mix of the two.
Oh, that's so cool.
So that's the first good one in, sci-fi romance. And then on a similar front, I'd say Hunt the Stars is another one that's kind of in that same like set in space. You got kind of like a mixed together crew. Yes, this is another one that's got some so good spice in it, and another good like trying to solve the conspiracy type situation. And if I'm remembering right, I think they're like trying to find a kidnapped child too, and so it's like a really high stakes for what they're trying to find. A little bit of an enemies to lovers moment in that, but really good. So that one's another great fantasy romance, or not fantasy, sorry, sci-fi romance.
Sci-fi romance.
And then I couldn't talk about sci-fi romance without talking about.
Oh my gosh.
Ice Planet Barbarian. It feels like the biggest jokes when you first hear about it to recommend that. I'm really glad they've rebranded with new covers because
have they? Those the ones that you have?
I don't have any physical copies of them.
Oh, you don't?
No.
I don't know why I thought you had.
Yeah, the original covers are. I mean, they're pretty rough, man. I don't know. They're not for me. I was scared to pick them up because of that. And luckily they've done some rebranding and I think they look a lot better. But it's a surprisingly great story. It's definitely high levels of spice. So very adult content. And this would be more on the, aliens and humans love side. So this is not just humans. So keep that in mind. It's a step up. But honestly, it's really good. And like even the story of this woman's journey of like getting to where she is really good. Yeah. So
it's so great. Funny. I remember when you were reading this a couple of years ago. I think it was right as I picked up ACOTAR. So I was coming over and Jenna used to have a daybed in her office and we would sit and she's like, let me tell you what just happened in my book. And I'm like, just like mouth dropped.
It's a different story, but it's great. And then if you like it, there's like 20 books in that series. So
and are they still coming out?
She probably is still putting some out. I honestly don't know. I mean, there are a lot of books in that series. They're all interconnected standalones. Yeah. So they kind of build off the story from before, but each book is a different couple.
Oh, when I first started my job and I was telling my coworkers that we were doing a podcast, she was like, have you done Ice Planet Barbarians? And I was like, no.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Maybe I'll convince Shelby.
That would be hilarious.
Yeah. So
I feel like I would be like red cheeked the whole time.
I know. I don't even know how I could talk about that book on the podcast. That's like too much spice to talk about.
Oh, we'll get into
That's for pride time. I know. Oh, so that's kind of wraps up maybe the romance side of it. But if you like a lot more humor in your books and you want it to be more on like the funny, I don't want to say lighthearted, but kind of funny lighthearted side, of like a couple fun ones that fit in there too. I talked about it last year, but the Murderbot Diaries, which starts with All Systems Red. It's just a novellas. They're shorter novellas, so that's kind of nice too to give a taste. And it's about a security consultant, I guess, is I think kind of what his what he's supposed to be called, but who's like a robot guy, who kind of like breaks free from his directive and realizes that he doesn't have to listen to humans anymore.
Oh my gosh.
But he's also just interested in watching like the TV dramas and stuff all day.
Oh my gosh.
It's not like he has some evil plot necessarily, but he ends up sort of diving into this conspiracy that he's finding too, and kind of ends up forming some relationships with some humans along the way. And it's just, there's so much inside of his head, and he's, I think, so funny. Yeah. And so I think that's another great one too, because the books are so short.
Oh, that's so fun. And I feel like having a really short book like that is going to be great as an intro too, because if you don't like it, it's short. It's small.
Exactly. Yep. I think that's so fun. So another one in the funnier side is Project Hail Mary. It's not necessarily a all over funny topic, but there's a side character that I think brings a lot of, lightness to the situation too. And so that is kind of heartwarming piece of it. Project Hail Mary is going to become a movie also. This is the same author as The Martian. If you ever watched that, you remember the Matt Damon movie too. And so the same author as that. And I'd say, think similar vibe to that too, if you've read that. So
that's so cool.
Yeah, a guy basically wakes up on his own in a spaceship, kind of doesn't really remember at first how he got there, but really he's been sent on this Hail Mary mission to try and save humanity.
Oh my gosh.
So great one. Funnier than you'd expect.
That's hilarious. And then another Brandon Sanderson.
Oh yeah, this is another Brandon Sanderson. I know, I'm sorry. I feel like I've got so much sci-fi.
You're totally fine.
Yeah, this one I think I also talked about last year, but the Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. I don't think this is everybody else's favorite Brandon Sanderson book, but I thought it was hilarious. I was loudly cackling the entire time I was reading this book. It is so funny, and I recommend getting a physical copy of it because the formatting is also like part of what makes it so funny. Like there's a lot of illustrations and things in this too that add to it. But basically there's a guy who wakes up again with not really very much memory of who he is or anything like that in a weird place. And as he's moving along, he kind of finds some little bits and pieces of scraps of paper that look like, think like a travel agency like booklet or something that has like information about like the different trips that you can go on. And so he realizes he's kind of come to this alternate dimension where he's supposed to be able to kind of be treated like a king because he has all this knowledge they don't necessarily have in that dimension. But then he doesn't really remember how he ended up there or how all the rest of his stuff got gone or how he's supposed to get back.
Oh my gosh.
It's just funny. It's so funny.
I remember you raving about that last year.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's so fun.
Well, should we take a break from sci-fi and do something else and maybe come back to it? Or you want to?
Or I could talk about what I've got first. I only have one and I haven't even read it yet. Yeah. It's Red Rising by Pierce Brown. And this book I've heard is such a good intro to fantasy and
sci-fi.
Yeah. We keep doing that.
I know.
Sci-fi, fantasy, same, but different. I have a bunch of friends who have read Red Rising and who've just loved it. And so, yeah, I'm super pumped. I think that's actually going to be my intro to sci-fi.
I love it. I'm excited for you.
And I think we're both just really excited to read that one too.
Yeah, that's been on my TBR too. I'm really excited to read that one. Definitely.
That is literally the only sci-fi that I have on here. I don't think I've read any other sci-fi yet.
I'll get you there.
I know, we'll get there. That's why we have this list, right?
Well, I think these could be some other places that might be good for you to start specifically. And this is, they're sci-fi, but they're set on Earth and they're more like a thriller than they are like, you know, deep space stuff, right? Because I think those are different types of sci-fi, but it still kind of fits in that bucket because it's maybe more about like time travel or alternate dimensions or things like that.
Yeah.
And so the first suggestion I have is really anything by Blake Crouch, but specifically Dark Matter and Recursion. I don't have a copy of it right now because I gave it to my mom.
Oh, yeah.
But Dark Matter, it's a TV show now. It just started on Apple TV.
And you started watching it, right?
Yeah, I started watching it. I like it so far.
Oh my gosh.
But these are great. They're all standalones and they're not too big. They're, I think, only like maybe 300 or 400 pages.
That's not bad.
He's got 3. He's got this Dark Matter, Upgrade, and Recursion. And so all like standalones. They're more on the thriller side. So it's a lot of like what's happening in the world. I don't understand what's happening to me, you know, trying to get back to my family or something like that.
Oh my gosh, I love it. And
so I think that's a great place to start in sci-fi because it's on Earth and everything is kind of exactly as you expect it to be, minus this like one weird element.
Yeah.
So I think that can be a really good place to start because it's not as like overwhelming. So that's one.
And I feel like that would also be a great place for me to start because I feel like we've talked about it. And so now it's like in my head to be like, Blake Crouch, I need to start with it.
Yeah, for sure. He's probably one of my favorite authors of all time. And then the other one that's again on Earth, but more, you know, technology things is Constance and its sequel Chance. And that's more about cloning is in that side.
Yep.
So a woman wakes up and realizes that she's like woken up in a clone body, like that she's actually that because her original self was murdered. And so she's going back and trying to solve her own murder.
Oh my gosh, that's
which is
so
super cool.
That's so cool.
I love those. Those are on Kindle Unlimited also.
I love it. I love it.
Okay, so moving on to some of the more deep space opera, that type of scenario. The first one I've got a suggestion for is the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. And it starts with Leviathan Wakes. This was, when I was saying that I read a lot of sci-fi before I kind of started getting back into reading again, this was my favorite series for a really long time. It probably wasn't until after I had read ACOTAR and after I had read some other books that there were ones that started to upstage it. But for a while, this series was my favorite. It's, I don't even know how to describe it. There's so much time, but deep space stories. There's like, you know, unknown enemies in the world that they don't understand. And it's kind of all over the place. Conspiracies and things across it, different politics between different areas of the universe. And it's great. It's a great,
so cool.
Again, kind of cobbled together crew sort of feel. It's got the found family bits of it. But it's a very long series and they're all pretty long books, but I think they're phenomenal.
Oh, I love that.
And then my last one, and then I'll be done with sci-fi. But this is all...
We were talking about on break really quick.
Yeah.
If we can get one person to read sci-fi, we win.
Yeah, I will consider this a success if I can convince one person to read one sci-fi book when they've not written sci-fi before, because it's so worth it. I think more people would like it than they give themselves credit for, especially if you already like fantasy.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. So my last one that is, again, kind of in the deep space side of it is Children of Time. This is in my top 5 favorite books of all time. It's amazing. It like really makes you question. I know I've talked about it a few times on the podcast, but it really makes you question like what is intelligence, and I don't know. We humans have set off on a deep space journey. They've been in cryosleep for thousands of years as they're making their way towards this planet that they've tried to precede with life. But it kind of tries to answer the question of like what happens if a different life form grew to be as intelligent or more intelligent than humans did, and how do we interact with them, and when there's an entirely different way that they approach the world.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it really makes you question I don't know, things about the world.
That's so cool, though. I love it. What a great list for sci-fi.
Yeah, there's a lot.
That makes me so excited, though.
That's good. It's clearly one of my favorite genres, so.
I love it. Well, because I've been hearing about it now for 2 years, and now I'm like, okay, you know what? I just need to do it. I just need to do it.
Oh.
All right, we have so many genres we want to talk about, and we definitely want to make sure we're going in depth on our recommendations for you guys. So we're going to end it here. We will have another episode next week for you.
Yeah, talking about some more genres. So come back next week to see more.
Awesome. We'll see you guys then.